after the war, the Americans and the Russians and the British and the French had all agreed, and the French had joined in by this time to defeat Germany. They all agreed that they would divide Germany up into 4 zones.
This seems like the most absurd way of dealing with a country, like an aggressor after, like.
Well, they had to. I mean, they had to say who's going to occupy what and who's, because
it just feels like they really could have had a better plan. They really could have thought a little bit longer, take a little bit longer, don't go first thought.
Who knows? But so Berlin, the Russians would take the Prussia, which is the northeastern part of Germany, which includes Berlin. But Berlin is such a huge city in Germany that they decided also that they would break up Berlin into 4 zones, with the British, French, Americans, and Russians each taking that zone. And then the British, French, and Americans, in that order, would take different zones in Germany, right? And then, of course, I'm not going to go into the whole detail, but things go south between the Americans and the Americans and British and French and the Russians. And so what happens in 1949 is that Britain, France, the United States, and the United States would unite their zones and create a country called West Germany, the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, the Federal Republic of Germany. The Russians would then declare the Democratic Republic of Germany, the Deutsche Demokratische Republika. And so Germany split into 2 countries, colloquially called East and West Germany. And then in Berlin, the Russians would try to get the Americans, French, and British to leave, but they refused. So the Russians put an embargo. They cut off all food and water into Berlin. So the Americans and British did a massive airlift of food, water, medicine, etc. into Berlin over about a year. And then the Russians finally gave up. And so West Berlin, as it was called, remained a little island of West Germany in the middle of East Germany. Okay, and then in 1961, the Russians would close off the entire. Well, they would close off the entire border in '49, but in 1961 they would build a wall around Berlin, around West Berlin. So essentially, they built a wall surrounding West Berlin, and it was literally a wall. And but they still negotiated allowing train service, so people in West Berlin could get on a train that wouldn't ever stop in Germany. East Germany would go all the way to West Germany, and so you can still take the train. You can still fly in and out of West Germany. West Germany was part of East Germany. I mean, part of West Berlin was part of West Germany. Any questions about that? What's kind of interesting about this is that the government of East Germany is, of course, a puppet government for the Russians. And so in Berlin, East Berlin, and the rest of East Germany, there was absolutely no information about the rape of Berlin until the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed, because the Russian government simply wasn't going to publicize that the Russian army had done that to German women. And so East Germans were actually shocked in the 90s when they found out about this. Well, the East German women who lived through it weren't shocked, but the rest of the population was.
Was West Germany also kind of just a puppet government for?
No, they were real. They had free elections. They moved closer or far. I mean, there were some people in the West German government who tried to build relationship with the Soviet Union and East Germany, etc., which wasn't exactly what the Americans or British wanted. But they were an independent country. They were really an independent country. They could do what they. Now there were American and British troops stationed there throughout most of the whole Cold War, and they recognized that if the United States and the Soviet Union went to war, Germany was toast. So they knew all that, but they were technically an independent country. They really did have some latitude. Any other questions about that?
What did they do with like Italy just got to kind of be set off on their own free?
Well, that was partly because of the way it went. The United States invaded Sicily in July of 1943, took it pretty quickly. And then they invaded southern Italy, the southern part of the toe of the boot, and they very quickly began to destroy the Italian army. And then Mussolini fell from power. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, who had named Mussolini as prime minister, in 1923, now removes him as prime minister in 1943, 20 years later, and then names somebody else as prime minister of Italy. And so Mussolini was just out of power, and the Italians immediately surrendered to the Americans and said, we're done. But then the Germans invaded Italy from the north, and they got a hold of Mussolini and put him back in power in something called the Salo Republic in northern Italy as a puppet. But southern Italy was an independent country, and the U.S. treated it as an independent country.
This is kind of just like a geography question. Pardon my ignorance. Is Sicily a different country than Italy?
No, it's technically part of Italy.
Okay,
They have-
Sicily's
they
part
have
of
a
Italy.
distinct cultural identity.
Yeah, they have a distinct cultural identity, and there have been times when there is a kingdom of Sicily, which is separate in history. So it's not always been part of Italy.
Okay, I've always wondered why. I don't know. I thought maybe they were too different because I feel like people who are Sicilian tend to make that distinction.
Yeah. Well, we actually saw that. Oh no, it was Corsican. Never mind. In the very long engagement, the guy's like, "I'm Corsican. I'm not French."
I was gonna say, Italy hasn't been part of Italy.
Well, yeah. I mean, Italy has only existed since 1871. So. Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have your hand up?
I was just thinking about Sardinia also being loosely tied to Italy for a very long time.
Yeah, and I mean Corsica has been part of Italy and has been part of France and goes back and forth.
Yeah. How did Corsica become a part of France?
It was one of those deals. It was in the late 1700s. I think it was the settlement at the end, maybe the War of the Austrian Succession or something like that. It was just one of those things that got handed over as part of the peace treaty. We get this, you get that.
That always confused the fuck out of me. That's a random island in the Mediterranean.
Napoleon he was born in French Corsica, so he was French, but he only made it by a couple of years. And if he'd been born 2 or 3 years earlier, he would have been born in Italian Corsica, or I forget who owned it, Piedmont and Sardinia and Corsica. Yeah. But yeah,
I mean, all the cities too were also their own little kingdom.
oh yeah, absolutely.
Italy's
Then they all got together and said, we're all going to speak like Dante did, and we'll be
Yes.
good to go.
Yep, and the rest is history.
Literally.
So the war in the Pacific lasted longer than the war in Europe for a couple of reasons. I mean, the big one being that it was just more territory to conquer, etc. The other one being that Germany just collapsed sooner. When you have both the Soviet Union and the Americans and British pushing down on you, it's you're going to collapse a lot faster than just the Americans. But so in the Pacific, as I mentioned before, the Americans basically, once they won at Midway and they had crippled the Japanese fleet, they decided they were going to start to retake the Pacific, and they came up with this plan called the island hopping. And essentially the U.S. Army did this southern route from Guadalcanal, which was the thin red line, through New Guinea, and then the Philippines, pushing up, coming from the south and sort of pushing up towards Japan that way. The Navy and Marine Corps, for their part, did this island hopping campaign across the Central Pacific with a whole bunch of islands, Iwo Jima and et cetera, Saipan, et cetera, all these battles. They were island hopping from one tiny island to another, basically going east across the center of the Pacific. They converged on Okinawa, which is a major island just south of Japan, which has sometimes been part of Japan and sometimes not been part of Japan. Okinawa is an interesting culture because it has some strong connections to China and some strong connections to Japan.
Aren't they the only recognized they're a special recognized indigenous group in Japan?
No, there's also the what's the name of the group? Maru.
In northern Japan too.
In northern
yes,
Japan,
yes.
there's an indigenous group also. The Ainu.
Yeah.
That's it. Any other questions? Okay, so by August of 1945, the U.S. has conquered Okinawa, and the next step is to invade Japan proper. And the U.S. had made it clear, partly because of their policy in Europe, because of fascism, they basically said, we will not negotiate a settlement. We're not going to leave fascists in power. So they had refused to negotiate with Hitler or with Himmler or anybody else in the Nazi government and had said, we're going to destroy you, and they did. The U.S. basically said the same thing to Japan, that we're not going to accept a negotiated peace settlement. We're not going to accept even a negotiated ceasefire. You have to do unconditional surrender, or we're just going to keep fighting until you do. And the Japanese didn't want that, and for one very particular reason. The Shinto religion really reveres the emperor. They see him as a godlike figure. And so the Japanese said, we will surrender with no conditions except you cannot hurt the emperor. And the Americans said, no, everything's on the table. If we want to hang him, we're going to hang him. You guys just have to surrender. And so Japan refused to surrender. So the U.S. began to make plans for invading Japan proper from Okinawa. And given the fact, I talked a while ago about the samurai code. One of the aspects of the samurai code is that you never surrender. It's a deeply, deeply humiliating to surrender. And so the Japanese had tended to refuse to surrender. They would just fight until they'd fight to the death rather than surrender. And the Americans knew that. And so when they started planning an invasion of Japan, they're like, okay, the Japanese are going to fight. They're not going to surrender. They're going to fight to the death. And we're going to have, we've seen the kind of death tolls that the Japanese, given Japanese numbers on Iwo Jima and American casualties, and given Japanese numbers on Saipan and American casualties, given Japanese numbers on Okinawa and American casualties, we can guess that invading Japan will be about 1 million deaths. And both American and Japanese. And so they were, it was just 1 million American casualties, not Japanese. Why?
Did the sort of right to surrender only pertain to the upper classes? Because in the Thin Red Line, a lot of the troops there were not doing, they were not fighting to the death. They were quite willing to just kind of give up. Although there was that one guy who presumably was an officer who was sitting in the middle kind of meditating, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. They did, I don't know if you noticed it in Thin Red Line, the guys who tended to have their shirts on were officers. If they had the red square there with the number of stars, that was they were officers. And I think the Thin Red Line was trying to show the sort of anguish that Japanese soldiers felt at failing because they had been taken alive, they hadn't died fighting. But you're absolutely right, a lot of them did surrender, they didn't fight to the death. There were cases where the Japanese would kill themselves rather than fight to the death. There's a movie that I think Clint Eastwood made, Letters from Iwo Jima, which looks at the Battle of Iwo Jima he made 2 movies. One is the American vision of Iwo Jima, and the other is the Japanese vision of Iwo Jima. And in the Japanese vision, the main characters, when they realize that they're about to get captured, just all take a hand grenade, pull the pin, and blow themselves up. And that actually did happen. In Okinawa, there was a horrific scene. There was some cliffs on one edge of the island, and when the Americans were pushing the Japanese back, the Japanese, not only did the Japanese soldiers jump off the cliff, they forced thousands of Okinawans to jump off the cliff too, to commit suicide rather than surrender to the Americans. So it was all over the map. Clearly in Thin Red Line, Japanese soldiers did surrender. They were captured, but it was just as likely that they would kill themselves or fight to the death or do some sort of suicide thing, just jump out your foxhole and run at the Americans until they shoot you, that kind of thing. So the Americans began to look for other options, and they had another option because in July of 1945, the Americans had set off their first atomic bomb test in New Mexico. And so they had an atomic bomb. And so they decided that they would show Japan what an atomic bomb could do in hopes that it would make the Japanese surrender. They sent a number of atomic bombs to the Pacific. They had a number of air crews that had atomic bombs, and they basically had chosen a whole series of cities that were big enough cities that there would be a high death toll, but were relatively untouched by previous bombing raids, so that the one bomb could really show what it could do. And they debated whether to just blow the top off of Mount Fuji to show what the bomb could do, but they didn't think that would horrify the Japanese enough because there wouldn't be death toll. So they decided they actually had
That
to
would be a crazy choice, though, to just like
blow up an active volcano.
yeah, like imagine what would have happened if that would have really been a different ending to the war.
Isn't Fuji active?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
I mean, that mountain in particular is very important and ancient and so that
Oh, absolutely.
even though it wouldn't have had the death, that probably would have sent a very strong message to blow it part of it.
But anyway, the Americans decided that they needed to show the Japanese what kind of a death toll atomic bombs could do. So they picked two sites, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they had it set up that the bomber crews were given the go order pending weather. Basically, it had to be a clear day so that the Japanese could see that it was one airplane dropping one bomb. And they had to be able to, have clear weather over their city so that they knew they were dropping it exactly where they wanted to drop it. So both air crews were given orders that next clear day you go. August 6th, the Hiroshima team had clear weather over Hiroshima, and so the bomber, the Enola Gay, flew over Hiroshima and dropped a single atomic bomb. They did not countermand the order. They would hope the Japanese would see this and surrender immediately. For whatever reason, there's a lot of debate about this, but they never counteracted the order to the second air crew. So on August 9th, 3 days later, there was clear weather over Nagasaki, and that crew went and dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. And some historians have alleged that this was an accident. The Americans simply forgot to tell that crew not to go. And they didn't mean to bomb Nagasaki. Others say that they said the Japanese had 3 days surrender and they haven't. We're going to show them we've got another bomb. This wasn't a one-off. We can keep doing this. And so they did Nagasaki on purpose. I'm not an American historian. I haven't studied it, so I can't tell you what the evidence is on both sides. In Hiroshima, about 50,000 people were killed instantly. And if you were close enough to the blast site, people were actually vaporized. They actually had shadows imprinted on concrete where somebody was standing, and the blast had bleached the concrete white, but it had vaporized the person, but that had absorbed enough energy to leave a shadow outline of the person on the concrete where they had been vaporized. Beyond that, there was, and the weird thing in Hiroshima is, of course, the bomb was set, it had an altimeter in it, so it went off like, I forget how many, 1,000 feet up or something, because they thought it would be a better blast radius. And one of the weird things about it is that the building directly at the center of the bomb site, right under the bomb, is still standing. It wasn't destroyed. But everything around it in a donut was absolutely blown, literally vaporized out a certain level. And then everything was blown up outside of that, destroyed, blown down, on fire, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they didn't know this, but atomic bombs spread radiation everywhere. And the US Army was actually shocked at how much radiation was spread all over Hiroshima. When they occupied Hiroshima months later, it was still highly radioactive.
Did they not? They'd blown up a couple bombs in the desert. Did they not bring some Geiger counters around and say, okay, so when we blow these up, the area around, you want to avoid that?
For whatever reason, they were shocked. Over the next 6 months or so, about another 50 to 80,000 people died from the bomb because they had gotten radiation burns. And radiation burns are basically what you're getting is the radiation coming off the bomb is so intense that you get what's basically a sunburn deep inside of your skin, like on the bottom layers of your skin, and it takes weeks to come out. And it can actually cause organ failure, et cetera. You're basically microwaving your internal organs. And so about 50 to 85,000 people died over the next 6 months. Part of it from radiation burns, because they were exposed to high radiation at the explosion. Part of it from radiation poisoning. They were simply in a highly radioactive area, and everything they ate and drank had all sorts of radiation in it, and they got cancer or radiation. Radiation poisoning can actually kill you faster than cancer. And we don't even know how many people, thyroid cancer rates were very high in Hiroshima for decades afterwards. So we can't count the number of people who died from that, but it was more. On October 9, bomber called the Flying Boxcar.
Crazy names. Is Enola Gay a person? Like, was that named after a person?
It's the mother of the pilot.
Oh!
And
how'd she feel about that honorific?
I don't know how she felt about it. The pilot drank himself to death after he died.
Well.
But I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Department of Defense website on Enola Gay was recently wiped because the word gay is in the airplane name.
I was aware of that.
My God.
Yes.
That's part of my presentation I did. I saw
Was I there?
that. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned that specifically.
So Hiroshima killed probably 130,000 people. Nagasaki was a smaller city, so about 70,000 people died. Roughly half of them immediately, and then half of them from radiation poisoning, etc. And this 6 months afterwards.
Was the amount of was the ratio for population? Was it almost 100% of the people in the city died, or was it about half?
I'm not sure. I mean, it depends on if you're talking about the city itself or the metropolitan area, etc.
Obviously.
I mean, everybody in an area about a mile across in Hiroshima died.
Yeah.
I mean, they were vaporized, and then significant death tolls for a couple miles out beyond that because of fires and et cetera. And then there was damage beyond that, but I don't know. I don't know what the population of Hiroshima was before. So, any other questions on that? The Japanese still didn't want to surrender because nobody in Japan wanted an unconditional surrender because it might mean the Americans would hang the emperor, and that was simply unacceptable.
Yeah, but
the emperor finally on September 2nd put his foot down and insisted that Japan surrender, otherwise the Americans would keep dropping atomic bombs. So the emperor did surrender, did put his foot down and say, I don't care if they hang me, we have to surrender. I can't let Japanese people keep dying in atomic bombs.
Couldn't they have they could have just eventually just dropped a bomb on Tokyo and circumvented the whole
issue.
Save him in the surrender situation.
Yeah, and the ironic thing, or sad, tragic, horrifying thing, is that they didn't drop a bomb on Tokyo because they had already done firebombing in Tokyo that killed 100,000 people in a single night, and the whole city was burned down, and they figured if they dropped an atomic bomb, would anybody notice? Because they had already wiped the city off the map.
More than good guys.
So September 2nd, 1945, not May 8th, is the end of World War II. I say that because a certain person who happens to be President of the United States is trying to make May 8th Victory Day in World War II, and nobody is telling him that we were still fighting until September. Overall, the numbers are still going up for the death toll in World War II because historians, especially in China, are still discovering records showing that the death toll was higher than anybody knew. Partly because the Japanese had induced famine in a lot of parts of China, and a lot of people died of starvation, and it wasn't in the records, or it was in local records, but it wasn't, counted as. But people are like, no, this really is a war, death here. So the numbers are still going up, but roughly, the range now is probably 70 to 95 million people died in World War II. In the 7 years from 8 years from 1937 to 7 years from 45. About 20 to 50 million died in Asia, most of them in China. About 35 to 45 million died in Europe. Of the 35 to 45 million who died in Europe, 26 to 27 million were Russians. So Russia was 2/3 of the death toll. Russia alone was 2/3 of the death toll in World War II. And that was partly because the Germans were carrying out the Holocaust in Russian territory. They were shooting Russian Jews, they were starving Russian citizens, etc. And partly because Russia's military strategy was expending Russian soldiers at a fast rate. They simply threw Russian soldiers at the Germans in huge numbers, knowing a lot of them were going to die.
Sorry, what was that fraction?
It was 35 to 45 million dead in Europe, and 26 to 27 million of those were Russian. And just to give you some idea, 13.7% of Russia's population died in World War II.
That's actually a crazy percentage.
13.7%. The number of soldiers was probably 8.7 to 13.8 million. They're not, the numbers are hazy because they don't have good documentation. About 4 to 9 million were murdered intentionally, like Jews who were shot by death squads, etc. And about 6 million starved to death. And there was an official German policy of starving Russians to death, so it worked. The U.S. Officially had 408,000 dead. The numbers are now up to like 420 because they found, identified remains and things like that. And almost all soldiers. Very few American civilians died because the only civilians who died would have been American nurses or civilian contractors, et cetera, who were in a war zone for some reason, and there's very small numbers. And just to give you some sense, Russia had 13.7% of its population die. The United States had 1/3 of 1% of its population die.
What was Russia had a smaller population than America even at the time, right?
Yeah, it was. I don't know what the U.S. population was at that point. I guess we could figure it out by multiplying 408,000 by 300. So 120 million. And Russia's population was not much less than that. It was I think 115 or something.
Yeah, so comparable.
Yeah. Germany had 7 to 8.5 million dead.
Yeah.
4.3 to 5.5 million of them soldiers. The rest were civilians. That represents about 8.23% of Germany's population.
Big number.
Great Britain had 460,000 dead, and that represents just shy of 1% of their population.
Yeah, not a big country.
France had 550,000 dead and more civilians than soldiers.
Well,
and that's about 1.5%.
Did France really have any soldiers for most of the war?
No, I mean they got defeated initially, and there was a high death toll there.
Yeah.
And then they had some fighting in Syria between the Free French and the Vichy French. So there's some French on French violence. And then when the Americans liberated and the British and Canadians liberated France in 1944, the French hastily put together an army and invaded Germany, and they took some pretty significant casualties there, but they were not, for a significant chunk there, they were not fighting. Japan had 2.5 to 3.1 million dead, which is most of them are soldiers, which is 4.33% of the population. China had 15 to 20 million dead, which is about 4% of the population.
Even then?
Yeah.
Dang. A lot of people.
Any questions about any of that? All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will start since you went away.
Is there movies about the Japanese offensive in China? I assume they're probably not English language movies.
There are movies that are sort of peripherally about it, set against that backdrop. What's the? Is it just The Last Emperor? It's about the Empire of the Sun. Is a movie about that. There were a couple movies that are much smaller scale. Here's a story that's set against that backdrop. I'm not aware of any movies in American culture that deal with Japanese versus China and militarily.
Well, yeah, because I'm just thinking in the Joy Luck Club. I don't know if you're aware of the book.
I've read it.
A small part of it is the protagonist's mother, escaping fleeing a city because the Japanese are coming into the city, and she is a officer's wife, and she has to leave, so she's not a victim of Japanese violence.
Have you all heard of the rape of Nanjing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nanjing was a huge city in China. The Japanese basically said to Nanjing that if you surrendered without fighting, you'd be saved, but if you resisted, the Japanese would punish the city. The Nanjing surrendered, but the Japanese claimed they didn't, and so the Japanese, for about 3 or 4 months, just let Japanese soldiers do whatever they wanted. There was mass murder, there was mass rape, there was absolute pillaging and looting, and the Japanese still deny the rape of Nanjing happened. They don't. There was a there was a Chinese American historian, she went to Harvard, I think, and she wrote a book, The Rape of Nanjing, and she was so harassed by Japanese people who didn't want to believe that this was true that she committed suicide. She was just basically harassed to death because there's a significant chunk of the Japanese population which is extremely nationalistic and conservative and doesn't want to hear anything about any Japanese atrocities during World War II.
Well, yeah.
Didn't happen.